My son called on a Thursday afternoon. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't say hello. He just told me, in a voice that wasn't quite his own, that his wife had decided I wasn't welcome at their house anymore. Not for holidays, not for dinners, not at all. I listened to him finish. Then I said, "I understand." He seemed surprised by that. He expected me to argue. I didn't. I hung up and called my attorney. The next morning, before I'd had my second cup of coffee, James called me back. He said, "Richard, we're ready. He has no idea what's coming." That was the part Michael never understood about me. He thought silence meant defeat. He'd thought that his entire life, even as a boy, if his father didn't raise his voice, his father had nothing to say. He was wrong then. He was wrong on that Thursday, too. My name is Richard Hayes. I'm 62 years old. For 31 years, I worked as a civil engineer, bridges, drainage systems, load-bearing foundations. The work taught me one thing above everything else. The most dangerous failures are the ones that look stable from the outside. You walk across a bridge every day. You don't see the corrosion happening 2 inches below the surface. Then one morning, the whole thing gives, and everyone acts surprised. I retired 4 years ago and moved into the house my wife Carol and I had built on Dunmore Street in Portland. Carol died of pancreatic cancer in 2019. The house is mine. The rental property on Ashworth Avenue is mine. The commercial lot on Belmont that I've held since 1998 is mine. The house on Dunmore Road, the rental on Sycamore. The commercial unit on Burnside, $4.3 million in property, all in my name. And Michael had been counting it for months. I mention this not to inventory my life, but because Michael and Victoria had been inventorying it for months before that phone call, and I knew it. Michael is my son. He's 38 years old and works in commercial lending. He married Victoria 6 years ago. I tried, in those early years, to find what my daughter Emma saw in her. Emma had called Victoria sharp and ambitious, and I took those as compliments. I was willing to be patient. Victoria had opinions about most things and expressed them with a confidence I'd learned to recognize as the kind that doesn't leave room for being wrong. For 2 years, I told myself that was simply her manner. Then Carol died, and in the months after, the manner changed shape. It started with suggestions, small ones. Michael mentioned over dinner in early 2020 that managing rental property was a lot of stress for someone on his own. Victoria said that consolidating assets into a family trust would simplify everything. She said it the way you say something that's already been decided. I nodded and changed the subject. I noted the date in a small notebook I keep in the kitchen drawer. By the following spring, the suggestions had become questions. By the fall, the questions had become requests. I said no each time, clearly and without explanation, because a man who explains his refusals in detail is a man who's already negotiating. I wasn't negotiating. The phone call in January was the first time Michael delivered Victoria's position directly, in her words, without any pretense that it was a conversation. I wasn't welcome. That was the message. No reason given, no room for discussion, just the verdict, handed down through my son's voice while he stood somewhere in their house in Lake Oswego and read from a script his wife had written. I said, "I understand." I meant it as a full sentence, not as a concession. I hung up and sat for a moment at the kitchen table. The neighbor's dog was barking somewhere down the block. I finished my coffee. Then I called James Morrison, who had been my attorney for 11 years, and who I had spoken with twice in the previous 3 weeks about exactly this kind of moment. James didn't answer that evening. He called me back at 7:40 the next morning. He said, "Richard, we're ready. He has no idea what's coming." I told him I knew. I told him to proceed. What Michael heard in my silence was surrender. What was actually in my silence was every document James had been preparing since November and the particular patience of a man who spent 3 decades calculating how much weight a structure could bear before it failed. Michael called back 2 days later. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and I was reviewing a drainage easement file I'd been asked to consult on a small project for a former colleague, the kind of work I still did occasionally to keep my mind from going soft in retirement. The call came at 2:14. I know because I had the file open on my desk and I wrote the time in the margin without thinking, the way you do when you've spent 30 years on job sites where everything gets logged. He said, "Dad, I wanted to follow up on our conversation." I waited. "Victoria and I have been talking," he said, "and we think the best thing for everyone, for the family, would be to transfer ownership of the house into our names, joint names, just to protect the asset. You know, estate planning. It's what people do." There it was. 2 days of silence on my end, and they'd decided the silence meant I was soft enough to push. I looked at the drainage easement file. The numbers were clean. I set my pen down. "No," I said. He paused. "Dad, we're not trying to take anything. We're trying to protect it. If something happened to you." I said, "No, Michael." Another pause. Longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had changed slightly, not angry yet, but tighter. The way a cable sounds when you've added load without accounting for it. "I just think you should consider it. Victoria did some research. There are real tax advantages." "I've considered it," I said. "The answer is no." I didn't explain further. In my experience, and I have considerable experience in structural matters of all kinds, the moment you start explaining a refusal is the moment the other party starts looking for the gap in your reasoning. I gave him no gap. I said goodbye and put the phone down and went back to the drainage file. What Michael didn't know was that the previous week I had spent 2.5 hours with James going through every document attached to every property I own: the house on Dunmore Road, the rental on Sycamore, the small commercial unit on Burnside that had been generating quiet income since 2009. James had organized them into a single binder with tab dividers, thorough work, the kind that takes longer to prepare than it does to read and is worth every hour. He is that kind of attorney. The call had been expected since November. That was when Emma, my daughter, who still came to Sunday dinner when her schedule allowed, had mentioned, carefully, that Michael had been asking her questions about the properties. What kind of questions? I'd asked. She'd looked at her hands. Questions about whether the titles were up to date, whether there was a mortgage, whether the commercial unit was in a trust. She had told him she didn't know. That was the right answer. When I said so, quietly, Emma looked at me with the particular expression she'd carried since she was about 9 years old, the one that meant she understood more than she was saying. 3 days after Michael's call, the email from Victoria arrived. It came at 8:47 in the morning to my personal account, which meant she had gone through Michael's contacts to find it. The subject line read, "Family Asset Planning Items for Discussion." I opened it at my kitchen table with a second cup of coffee going cold beside me. The email was 3 pages long. Victoria had formatted it carefully with headers and sub-bullets, the way someone does when they want to appear organized rather than aggressive. Under a section titled Current Holdings Proposed Transfer, she had listed, in order, the house on Dunmore Road, which she valued at approximately $410,000 based on recent comparable sales, the savings account she somehow knew existed, which she estimated at somewhere between $80,000 and $100,000. She was short by about $40,000, but the fact that she was estimating at all told me something. The rental on Sycamore, listed by address and estimated rental income, and the commercial unit on Burnside, listed with a note that said further appraisal recommended. She had done research. That was clear. What was also clear was that she had done it without asking me, which meant she'd been doing it for some time. The email ended with a paragraph that began, "We understand this may feel abrupt, but we want to assure you that our intentions are entirely focused on keeping the family's assets secure and properly managed going forward." I read the email twice. Then I closed my laptop, finished what was left of the cold coffee, and did not reply. I called James instead. He was in his office on Southwest Morrison. He's been in that building for 22 years, in a suite on the 4th floor with a window that faces the park. When I got there that afternoon, he had the binder already open on his desk. His assistant, a woman named Ruth, who has worked with him for 14 years, brought in 2 cups of coffee without being asked and closed the door behind her. I showed James the email on my phone. He read it without expression. When he finished, he set the phone on the desk and looked at me over the top of his reading glasses. "Richard," he said, "Michael retained an attorney 6 weeks ago." I put my cup down. "His name is Dennis Farrell," James said. "He's a civil litigator out of Lake Oswego. Decent reputation, mostly contract work. Michael's been consulting with him since mid-October." He opened the binder to a tabbed section near the back. Farrell filed a preliminary inquiry with the county assessor's office in November. He was checking the ownership structure on all 4 properties. I looked at the page James had turned to. It was a copy of a public records request, the kind anyone can file, with Michael's attorney's firm name at the top. "What's the theory?" I asked. "Farrell's been building a case," James said, "that you have a legal obligation to provide financial support to Michael as a dependent family member. It's a thin argument you'd almost certainly win, but thin arguments filed properly can tie up assets for months, freeze transfers, create complications." He tapped the page. "That's the play. Not to win in court, to make the properties difficult to move or manage until you agree to the transfer." I sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, the park was gray and quiet. A man was walking a yellow dog along the path by the fountain. The dog stopped to investigate something near a bench, and the man waited patiently, hands in his pockets. "How long have you known?" I asked. "I had a strong suspicion in November," James said. "I confirmed it last week through a colleague who knows Farrell's firm." He closed the binder. "That's why I said we were ready." What Michael thought, when I didn't reply to his call about the house transfer, was that I was confused, possibly hurt. Possibly, and this is the part that must have felt reassuring to him, too proud to engage. What he did not think was that I had been sitting across from James Morrison in that 4th-floor office, going through a binder that contained every title, every deed, every recorded easement and tax filing attached to everything I owned, while his own attorney was filing public records requests 2 floors below at the county assessor. They had no idea I was already preparing. That was the point. That had always been the point. The call I had made the night Michael first delivered Victoria's message, the call to James at 7:40 the next morning, had not been a reaction. It had been a continuation. I had called James in November when Emma mentioned the questions about the property titles. I'd called him again in December when I noticed that Michael had stopped asking about Sunday dinner and started asking, in a roundabout way, whether I'd updated my estate documents. I'd called him a 3rd time in January after Carol Hutchins came to my door on a Thursday afternoon. Carol has lived next door for 22 years. She knocked the way she always does twice. Brief, not urgent, and when I opened the door, she was holding a folded piece of paper and looking at me with the particular expression she reserves for things she has decided to say, despite preferring not to. She handed me the paper. On it, in her careful handwriting, was a license plate number and the make and color of a vehicle. "Dark blue Subaru Outback, Oregon plates," she said. "There was a man out front yesterday morning. He parked across the street and walked the length of the house twice with his phone out. I wrote it down because it didn't feel right." I looked at the plate number. I already knew whose car it was. I thanked Carol and told her she had done the right thing. She nodded once and went back to her own front walk without another word. I closed the door, went to the kitchen table, and called James Morrison before I had sat down fully. "Carol Hutchins just handed me a plate number," I said. "It's Michael's car." James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's the 3rd confirmation. I'm moving the timeline up." By the time Victoria's email arrived, James had already drafted the amended property trust, restructured the commercial unit's ownership through a separate LLC, and prepared a response to whatever Farrell filed a response that included documentation going back 11 years, covering every financial transaction I had ever made on Michael's behalf: college tuition, the down payment on his first apartment, the loan in 2017 that he had never repaid and that I had never mentioned, but that James had quietly noted and documented at the time, because James is the kind of attorney who notes and documents things quietly and in advance. The dependency argument Farrell was building would require Michael to demonstrate financial need. The documentation James had assembled would demonstrate, instead, a pattern of support that Michael had received and not acknowledged, and, in several cases, actively misrepresented to his own attorney. Farrell, James believed, did not know about the 2017 loan. He did not know about the tuition payments. He did not know about the 3-year period when I had quietly covered Michael and Victoria's health insurance premiums after Michael's company downsized, and he hadn't told Victoria they'd lost coverage. He told his attorney he'd received minimal support, James said. That's going to be a problem for him. I nodded. The man with the yellow dog had moved on. The bench by the fountain was empty. What do we do now? I asked, though I already had a sense of the answer. We wait, James said. We let Farrell file. We let Michael believe he has the initiative. And then we respond. He looked at me steadily. You're comfortable with that timeline? I told him I'd spent 30 years in civil engineering, which is a profession built almost entirely on understanding what happens when you apply force to a structure that appears solid. The key insight, the one that takes most engineers a decade to internalize, is that structures rarely fail at the point of application. They fail at the hidden weakness, the joint that looked fine in the drawing but was never quite right, the load path that worked perfectly until the day it didn't. Michael had built his case on the assumption that I was the weakness. He had been wrong about that since November, possibly longer. I picked up my coffee. It had gone cold while we talked. I drank it anyway, and James refilled his own cup from the carafe on the credenza, and we spent the next 40 minutes going through the binder tab by tab, making sure everything was exactly where it needed to be. Ruth knocked once before we finished and reminded James he had a 4 o'clock. James thanked her and closed the binder and slid it across the desk toward me. Take it home, he said. Read through the trust section again. If anything looks wrong to you, call me tonight. Nothing looked wrong. I had read it 3 times already, but I took the binder because James had prepared it carefully, and careful preparation deserves to be carried with both hands. I drove home on Burnside, past the commercial unit, which was fully leased and generating exactly the income it had generated for the past 6 years. The lights were on inside. I didn't stop. I just noted it, the way I note most things without reaction, without announcement, as a simple fact in a longer record that was still being written. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, not by regular mail, by certified delivery, which meant someone had to sign for it, which meant the sender wanted proof that it had been received. I signed for it myself. The postal carrier that morning was a young man I didn't recognize, a substitute covering Gerald's route. He handed me the envelope and a pen without making eye contact. I signed, took the envelope, and went back inside. The return address was a law firm on Southwest Broadway. I recognized the name on the letterhead before I had fully opened the flap. Callaway & Reeves, a mid-sized firm that handled estate disputes and property transfers. I had seen their name once before, on a filing submitted in a neighbor's boundary dispute 3 years ago. They were competent enough. They were also expensive, which told me something about how seriously Michael had decided to pursue this. I sat down at the kitchen table and read the document from the first line to the last. It was 11 pages. I read it twice. The language was careful, the kind of careful that comes from a lawyer who knows exactly what he is doing and wants to leave no visible seam. The document was framed as a family asset protection agreement, which was a phrase I had never encountered in 31 years of reading contracts. It requested, and the word requested appeared 4 times in the first 3 pages, always in italics, always with a footnote that I voluntarily transfer 40% of the family trust assets into a jointly managed account to be administered by Michael and a financial trustee of his choosing. The stated reason was preservation of generational wealth and protection of beneficiary rights. The document cited 2 Oregon statutes, both of which I recognized, neither of which said what the document implied they said. I set it down. I drank the rest of my coffee, which had gone cold while I was reading. Then I put the 11 pages back in the envelope, folded the envelope once along its length, and set it on the counter next to my keys. I called James at 8:47 that morning. He picked up on the second ring. Callaway and Reeves, I said, 11 pages, certified delivery. There was a pause. Not the pause of surprise. James didn't surprise easily, but the pause of a man who is already thinking through the next 4 moves. Bring it in, he said. This afternoon, if you can. I could. James read through the document at his desk while I sat across from him. He didn't speak while he was reading. He turned each page deliberately, and once, near the end, he went back to page 3 and read a passage a second time. When he finished, he set the document flat on his desk and looked at it for a moment without touching it. You know what this is, he said. It wasn't a question. Tell me what you see, I said. He leaned back. The 40% request is the visible part. The mechanism underneath it is what matters. He tapped the document once, near the bottom of page 9. This clause here, the one about beneficiary rights, it's a foundation. If you sign this and then later decline to make additional transfers, they can argue that you've established a precedent of voluntary participation. It becomes the basis for a claim that you've been withholding support that you previously acknowledged you owed. And the statutes they cite. Neither one applies to a living grantor with capacity. They both pertain to incapacitated estates. He looked at me over his glasses. Whoever drafted this was counting on you not to know that. I had known it, but I wanted James to say it out loud, because James saying it out loud was a different kind of knowing, the kind that gets written into a record. What's the next step after this? I asked. If you don't sign, they file, probably within 30 days. He folded his hands on the desk. The claim would be something along the lines of a parent's obligation to provide for adult children, which has no legal standing in Oregon. But that's not the point. The point is to create a proceeding, to get you into a courtroom where the conversation is about your assets and their access to them. I looked at the window. The building across the street had scaffolding on its south face, a seismic retrofit that had been going on for 6 weeks. The workers moved along the metal framework with the particular efficiency of people who had done the same motion so many times it no longer required thought. Let them file, I said. James nodded. He had been waiting for that answer. I suspected he had been waiting for it since the first week of October, when I had called him after Michael's phone call and told him to begin preparing. We had spent 11 weeks building what James called a complete record. Every document, every property valuation, every trust amendment, every communication. The record was not a defense. It was a foundation. There is a difference, and the difference matters. Emma called that evening. She called from her cell, not the house line, which meant she was somewhere she didn't want to be overheard. I could hear traffic in the background. She was outside, or in her car. Dad, she said, I need to tell you something. All right, I said. She was quiet for a moment. I had lunch with Michael on Friday. He didn't tell me he was meeting with you or sending anything, but he said some things that didn't. She stopped. He said he'd spoken to a lawyer about protecting the family's financial future. He said you'd been difficult about it. I let the word sit between us for a moment. Difficult. He said you'd refuse to have a reasonable conversation. Emma continued. Her voice was careful, the way it gets when she's trying to be fair to everyone and finding it increasingly hard. And then he mentioned very casually, like it was nothing that he might need to take legal steps to protect what's ours. What's ours? I repeated. His word, not mine. She paused. Dad, what is he doing? I thought about how to answer that. Emma was 35 years old. She had her mother's directness and her mother's patience, two qualities that do not always coexist, but in Emma, they had always balanced each other well. She deserved a straight answer. Your brother has decided that the best way to secure his financial future is to use legal pressure to access assets that aren't his. I said, the documents he sent today are the beginning of that process, not the end. She was quiet for a long time. I could hear the traffic thinning out, which meant she had moved somewhere quieter. He told me you'd been refusing to support the family, she said. He's been telling people that. Karen Whitfield called me last week. She said she'd heard from Victoria that you'd cut Michael off completely, that you were being vindictive. Karen Whitfield had been a neighbor for 14 years. She attended the same church as Victoria's mother. The information traveled in a straight line, and I could see exactly where it had started. "What did you tell Karen?" I asked. "I told her I didn't know the details," Emma said, which was true at the time. "It's still mostly true," I said. "The details are mine to manage." "Dad," her voice shifted, not angry, but firm. "I'm not going to pretend I don't know something is happening. Tell me what you need me to do." That was Emma. Not what do you need, but what do you need me to do? She had always understood that there's a difference between sympathy and usefulness. "Right now," I said, "I need you to do nothing. Don't confront Michael. Don't tell him you spoke to me. Don't ask him questions he'll recognize as questions." I paused. "Your brother has chosen a path. I'm going to walk mine. The two paths are going to meet at some point, and when they do, I need everything to be exactly where I've placed it." She didn't respond immediately. I could hear her breathing, slow and measured. "He's my brother," she said finally. "I know," I said. "That doesn't change what he's doing." Another pause. Then, "Okay, I won't say anything." "Thank you." "But Dad," she stopped herself. "Go ahead. Just don't let this go too long. Whatever you're doing, don't let it go so long that there's nothing left to fix." I thought about that after we hung up. The commercial unit on Burnside was generating its rent. The residential properties were fully occupied. The trust documents were current, witnessed, and filed. James had a complete copy of everything, organized into sections I could locate in under 2 minutes. Nothing had been left to chance, and nothing had been left too long. What Emma meant, I knew, was something different from what she said. She meant don't let this go so long that Michael can't come back from it. She was already thinking about the aftermath, about whether there would be a family left when the path ended. I understood the concern. I didn't share it, not in the way she meant it. Michael had made choices. He had made them deliberately over a period of months, with legal counsel and his wife's encouragement and what appeared to be a complete calculation of what he stood to gain. A man who plans that carefully does not deserve to have the consequences managed around him. But I understood what Emma was asking, and I kept it with me. The following week, I received a second letter from Calloway and Reeves. This one was shorter, 3 pages, and its tone had shifted. The word requested was gone. In its place was in accordance with, and the footnotes cited a different set of statutes, these ones pertaining to trustee obligations and beneficiary notification requirements. The letter informed me that if I had not responded to the initial agreement within 14 days, they would be filing a formal petition in Multnomah County Circuit Court to compel a review of the trust's administration. 14 days. I noted the date on a piece of paper and set it on my desk. I called James that afternoon and read him the relevant sections. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Good. This is what we wanted." "I know," I said. "The petition gives us the form. We couldn't have chosen a better one." He paused. "Everything is ready on our end. Patricia has the notarized copies. I've filed the supplemental trust amendment with the county. Judge Winters has the case on his calendar for the 19th. The 19th was 11 days away. I had 11 days of silence left. "They've been talking," I said, "to neighbors, to people we both know." "I'm aware," James said. "A woman named Whitfield left a message at my office last week asking whether I was representing you in a dispute with your son. I didn't return the call." "Good." "Richard," James's voice was level, "they think you haven't responded because you don't know what to do. Let them keep thinking that." I intended to. The legal papers were sitting in a folder on my desk, the original 11 pages and the follow-up 3. I had read them carefully, more carefully than their authors probably expected. And I had another plan, one that had been building since October, one that did not require me to say a single word until the 19th of the month. I drove past the commercial unit on Burnside that evening on my way home. The lights were on. A couple was walking past the storefront, not paying attention to it, the way people walk past things that have always been there. I had built that building's foundation myself 31 years ago when Michael was 7 years old and used to come to the site on Saturdays and ask me why concrete had to cure before you could put weight on it. I had told him because the strength isn't visible while it's forming. You have to wait. You have to give it time. If you put weight on it too soon, it cracks. And a crack in the foundation doesn't stay in the foundation. He had nodded, the way children nod when they are listening, but not yet understanding. Some lessons take longer than others. I drove home and made dinner. The folder sat on my desk. The 19th was 10 days away. The party happened on a Saturday. Emma called me that Friday evening, around 7, while I was reviewing the revised survey maps James had sent over. Her voice had the particular quality it gets when she is choosing words carefully measured, slower than usual, with small pauses where she is deciding what to include and what to leave out. I recognized it because she had used that same voice at 16 when she was trying to tell me something she thought would upset me without actually upsetting me. "Dad," she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to know that I didn't find out until today." I set the survey maps down. She told me that Michael was hosting a dinner the following evening. Not a small dinner, a proper event, the kind with a caterer and a bar and folding tables arranged in their backyard. She had seen the guest list by accident, she said, because Victoria had sent a confirmation email to the wrong address. 43 names, neighbors from their street, 3 couples from the firm where Michael worked, 2 people from the neighborhood association where I had served on the board for 11 years, a woman named Diane Kowalski, who had been my wife, Carol's closest friend, for the better part of 2 decades. My name was not on the list. "Michael told me not to tell you," Emma said. "He said it was a private event and that you wouldn't want it to come anyway. He said," she paused, "he said you'd make it uncomfortable." I looked at the survey maps on my desk. The property lines were exactly where they had always been. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "Dad, are you—" "I'm fine. Emma, get some sleep." I hung up and sat for a moment in the chair that had been in that room since Carol and I bought it at an estate sale in 1994. The leather on the left armrest had worn through in one spot, about the size of a quarter, from years of my thumb resting there while I read. I ran my thumb across it now. Then I picked up my phone and sent James Morrison a brief message. "They're moving faster than we expected. The timeline holds. Don't change anything." He replied 4 minutes later with 2 words, "Understood. Ready." I went to bed at 10:15 and slept without difficulty. I had learned, in 31 years of engineering, that the night before a structure is tested is not the time to redesign it. The following Monday, the emails began. The first came from a man named Robert Tilden, who had worked with me on the Burnside Corridor project in 2009, and whom I had not spoken to in perhaps 18 months. The subject line read, "Checking in." The body of the email was 3 sentences. He had heard some things at a gathering over the weekend. He wanted to know if everything was all right between me and my son. He said he was sure there were 2 sides to every story. I read it once. I did not reply. The second email came Tuesday morning from Diane Kowalski, Carol's friend, the woman who had sat with my wife through 3 rounds of treatment and driven her to appointments when I was on job sites and couldn't get away. Diane's email was longer and more careful than Robert's. She wrote that she had been at Michael and Victoria's dinner on Saturday and that some things had been said that she found she used the word troubling. She did not specify what things. She said she was writing because she had known me for 22 years and felt she owed me the courtesy of asking directly before drawing any conclusions. I read Diane's email twice. I appreciated that she had written it. I did not reply to that one either. By Wednesday, I'd received 5 more, 2 from people I knew well, 3 from people I knew only by name. The pattern was consistent. They had been at the party, or they had spoken to someone who had been at the party, and they had heard something that made them want to reach out. None of them said exactly what they had heard. They didn't need to. The shape of it was clear enough from the questions they were asking. Is it true you refused to help Michael when he needed it? Is it true you've been withholding support for years? We heard there might be legal trouble. Is there something we should know? I kept each email in a folder on my desktop. I labeled the folder with the date and did not open it again. On Thursday, Emma called again. This time her voice had lost the careful quality. She sounded tired, and something else, a particular kind of tired that comes not from lack of sleep, but from having to hold two things in your mind at once that don't fit together. I talked to Michael, she said. I asked him what he said at the party. I waited. He said you've been refusing to put the Millbrook property in a trust for the family. He said you've been making decisions about the estate unilaterally, without consulting anyone, and that he said it's affecting the whole family's financial future. She exhaled. He said you've been treating the property like it's yours alone, and that he had to take legal steps to protect his interests because you wouldn't negotiate in good faith. The Millbrook property. 41 years in that house. Carol had painted the kitchen herself. Twice. Because she changed her mind about the color after the first coat dried, and I had told her it looked fine when it didn't, and she had known I was wrong and done it again without saying so. The second color was still on those walls. What else did he say? I asked. Emma was quiet for a moment. He said you're selfish, that you always have been, that you built everything for yourself and called it family. Another pause. Victoria was nodding the whole time he was talking. I don't think she wrote those words, but I think she practiced them with him. I said, Emma, I need you to do something for me. What? I need you to remember this conversation exactly as it happened. The date, what he said, how he said it. Can you do that? She was quiet again, longer this time. Dad, what did you file? Get some rest. I said, the 19th is in 4 days. The Millbrook Road property was worth, at current market assessment, $1.4 million. It was in my name. It had been in my name since Carol and I purchased it in 1983, and it had remained in my name through 41 years of mortgage payments. 2 roof replacements, a full foundation repair in 2007 that I had engineered myself, and that had cost me $63,000 out of pocket. Michael had lived in that house from age 4 until he left for college. He had not contributed to the foundation repair. He had not been asked to. The commercial building on Hawthorne, the one whose foundation I had poured 31 years ago, while Michael stood on the site asking me about concrete, had been assessed at $840,000 in the most recent county filing. It generated monthly rental income from 2 long-term tenants. That building was also in my name. Together, the 2 properties represented the principal assets of what James had taken to calling, in his careful legal language, the Hayes family estate. Michael had been told about both properties many times over the years. He knew their approximate values. What he did not know, what neither he nor Victoria had thought to verify, was the precise status of the documents governing them. That was the thing about assumptions. People make them most confidently when they believe they already know the answer. Michael had assumed, for at least the past 8 months, that the estate was structured the way he imagined it to be. He had built his entire legal strategy on that assumption. He had invited 43 people to a party and told them a story about his father based on that assumption. He had put weight on the concrete before it cured. Friday morning, I drove to James Morrison's office on Southwest 5th. I parked in the same spot I always used, on the street level, because the garage charged $8, and I had been parking on that street for 11 years and saw no reason to change. James was already at his desk when I arrived. Patricia Chen had sent over the final certification the previous afternoon, and James had the documents arranged in 2 folders, one for the hearing, one for the record. He handed me the thinner of the 2 folders. Everything is in order, he said. Judge Winters has the preliminary filing, Monday morning, 9 o'clock. I looked at the top page. The notarization date, Patricia's signature, neat and level, the way it always was. I had worked with Patricia on 4 property transactions over the past decade. She was 31 years old and had the particular quality of someone who had chosen precision as a vocation rather than a compromise. She did not make errors. She also did not overlook them. Has Michael's attorney contacted you? I asked. Twice this week, James said. once to request a continuance, once to request documentation I'm not obligated to provide before Monday. He paused. They're nervous. They should be, I said. I signed the authorization page at the bottom and handed the folder back. James set it beside the thicker one and squared the edges of both against the corner of his desk. Outside, on Southwest 5th, a delivery truck was backing into a loading zone with the particular grinding sound of a vehicle that needed its brakes looked at. One more thing, James said. He reached into his desk drawer and set a single sheet of paper in front of me. Michael's attorney filed a motion yesterday afternoon to have you declared an interested party in a dispute over estate management. It's procedural. They're trying to establish standing before Monday, but it means they intend to argue that you've been mismanaging the estate to the detriment of other family members. I read the motion. It was one page, double-spaced, and it used the phrase failure to act in good faith 3 times. I set it back on James's desk. They threw a party, I said, and told everyone I was selfish. Now they've filed a motion saying I've been mismanaging. I looked at the 2 folders. They're very busy for people who haven't looked at the actual documents. James allowed himself a small, controlled expression that was not quite a smile. Monday, he said. Monday, I said. I drove home on Burnside, the long way, past the corridor project I had worked on in 2009. The roadbed was still level. The drainage still ran correctly. 31 years ago, I had told a 7-year-old boy that concrete has to cure before you put weight on it, and that a crack in the foundation doesn't stay in the foundation. The 19th was 3 days away. I had already filed. They had thrown a party and told everyone I was selfish, and I had said nothing, and I had already filed, and they did not know it yet. The email arrived at 6:14 on a Thursday morning. I was at my desk with coffee, reading through the structural assessment James had sent the night before, when my laptop chimed. The subject line read, "Final Notice, Hayes Family Property Matter." Michael had written it himself. I could tell by the phrasing, the same clipped cadence he used when he was trying to sound authoritative. The same pattern I had watched him practice since he was 12 years old and arguing about curfew. The body of the email was 4 sentences. I read them twice, then set my coffee down. You have refused to engage in good faith. You have refused to consider the family's interest. You have nothing of value to offer this process. We will take what we need through the courts. 4 sentences, 31 words. I printed it, dated it in the margin with a ballpoint pen, and added it to the folder James had labeled Exhibit G. I did not reply. Victoria called that same afternoon at 2:47. I was on the back porch, checking the drainage grade along the south foundation. I had noticed a slight settling near the corner post. Nothing structural, but worth monitoring. My phone was in my shirt pocket. I saw her name and answered on the 3rd ring. She did not say hello. She said, "I want you to understand something before Monday." Her voice was steady and deliberate, the voice of someone who had rehearsed the call. "Michael is done waiting for you to come around. He's done pretending this is a negotiation. You are a loser. Richard, that's what you are. You had everything handed to you, and you couldn't hold on to any of it. Not your marriage, not your son, not your relevance. Michael has already moved on. He forgot about you a long time ago." Then she hung up. I stood on the back porch for a moment with the phone in my hand. A crow landed on the fence post at the far end of the yard, looked at me once, and flew off. The drainage grade along the south wall was fine. I had measured it wrong the first time. I went inside, made a second cup of coffee, and wrote down the time of the call and Victoria's exact words in the small notebook I had been keeping since September. Not because I needed it. James had already prepared everything that mattered, but I had spent 31 years documenting site conditions before they became problems, and old habits are useful habits. James called at 7 the next morning. I was already dressed. "Richard," he said, "everything is in order. They filed the preliminary motion yesterday afternoon. It came through at 4:52. Judge Winters has the case. We have our response ready, and we have the supporting documents organized exactly as we discussed." He paused. "They're going to walk into that conference room on Monday, believing they have already won. "I know," I said. "Are you ready?" I looked at the folder on my kitchen table, Exhibit A through Exhibit G, tabbed and ordered. 3 months of quiet work. Every document James had requested, located and delivered without announcement. The amendment, the appraisal, the transfer records, Patricia Chen's notarized statement, and one additional item that Michael and Victoria did not know existed that I had not mentioned to anyone except James, that was now sitting in a sealed envelope behind the last tab. "I've been ready since September," I said. The conference room at the Multnomah County Courthouse was on the 3rd floor. I arrived 8 minutes early. Michael and Victoria were already inside. I could see them through the narrow window in the door before I entered. Michael was standing near the window, jacket on, hands in his pockets. Victoria was seated at the table, a leather portfolio open in front of her, talking to the man beside her, who I assumed was their attorney. She was smiling. Michael turned when I opened the door, and for a moment his expression shifted into something I couldn't quite name. Not surprise exactly, more like the recalibration of someone who had expected a different version of the person who just walked in. I set my briefcase on the table, sat down across from them, and folded my hands. Their attorney introduced himself. I nodded. Victoria glanced at Michael. Michael looked at the briefcase. James arrived 2 minutes later, set his own folder on the table thicker than theirs, already tabbed, and sat beside me without a word. The room was quiet. Michael was still smiling, but it had changed quality. It was the smile of a man who believed the outcome was already decided, who was waiting for the formality to conclude so he could collect what he had come for. They had no idea what was about to happen. The attorney across the table, a man named Gerald Fitch, whose name I had looked up 3 weeks earlier, opened his folder and began speaking in the measured tone of someone who had rehearsed this. He said that Michael and Victoria had come today in good faith. He said the family had reached a point where certain financial arrangements needed to be formalized. He said that my continued refusal to acknowledge my son's legitimate interest in the family estate had created an untenable situation. Then he slid a document across the table. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "our position is straightforward. Michael is requesting that you execute a transfer of 40% of the Hayes family real estate portfolio within 48 hours. If you decline, we will file in Multnomah County by Friday morning." Victoria had her hands folded on the table. She was watching me the way people watch a door they expect to open. Michael was still holding the edge of his folder, straightening it, the same gesture I had counted 11 times in the past 20 minutes. I looked at the document Fitch had slid across. I did not pick it up. James, beside me, did not move either. The room held that particular silence of a place where someone has just said something they believe to be final. Fitch sat back slightly. Victoria uncrossed and recrossed her ankles. Michael said, "Dad, this doesn't have to be complicated. We're just asking you to be reasonable." That word reasonable had been used to describe a great many things in the past 8 months. Victoria had called it reasonable when she suggested Michael should be added to the deed. Michael had called it reasonable when he asked me to sign over power of attorney for the Eastside properties. The word had been stretched so far from its original shape that it no longer meant what it was supposed to mean. Michael leaned forward slightly. "You have nothing to fight us with, Dad. You never did. That's why we're here." I looked at him for a moment. "I know," I said. Then I reached down and opened my briefcase. What I took out was not a counteroffer. It was not a response to Fitch's document. It was a manila envelope, standard size, sealed with a single strip of packing tape. I set it on the table in front of Michael and left my hand on it for a moment, then withdrew. "Read that," I said. Michael looked at it. He looked at Fitch. Fitch gave a small nod, the kind of nod that means go ahead. It's probably nothing. Michael picked up the envelope, broke the tape, and opened it. He read the first page. His jaw did not drop. Nothing so dramatic. What happened was more like watching a building settle a small, almost imperceptible shift, something in the load-bearing structure giving way. He turned to the second page, then the third. Victoria leaned toward him. "What is it?" Michael did not answer. Michael. Her voice had a new edge to it. What does it say? He set the pages down on the table. His hands were steady, but the color had gone out of his face in the way it goes when the body is deciding what to do next and hasn't finished deciding. What the envelope contained was a copy of a communication dated 11 weeks earlier between Michael and a Portland attorney named Dennis Carr, in which Michael had retained Carr to prepare a civil complaint against me for, as the document phrased it, willful refusal to provide financial support to an adult dependent family member and deliberate withholding of assets to which the claimant has a reasonable expectation of access. There were 3 additional pages of supporting materials Carr had drafted at Michael's direction, including a summary of my real estate holdings, an estimate of their assessed value, $4.3 million, which was accurate, and a proposed timeline for asset transfer. Dennis Carr had been my attorney for 19 years before Michael approached him. Carr had called me the same afternoon Michael left his office. He had sent me the full file by certified courier the following morning. I had been waiting 11 weeks. "Those are your words," James said. He was looking at Michael, not at Fitch. "That is your signature on the retention agreement on page 1. That is your handwriting on the margin notes on page 4, where you wrote, and I'll read it exactly, he won't fight it if we move fast enough." Fitch leaned forward and picked up the pages. He read quickly. I watched his face. He was a professional and his face was trained. But there is a particular quality to the silence of a lawyer who has just realized his client did not tell him everything, and Fitch had gone very quiet in exactly that way. Victoria said, "Michael, what is this?" Michael said, It's not what it looks like." "It looks like you hired a lawyer to sue your father," she said. Her voice had gone flat, not shocked, recalibrating. "Before you came to me with this plan. Before you told me we were doing this together." "Victoria, was I in that meeting with Carr?" He didn't answer. James said, "Mrs. Hayes was not present at any of the meetings with Dennis Carr. We have the sign-in logs from Carr's office for all 3 visits. Her name does not appear." Victoria sat back. Something had shifted in her posture, not guilt, not remorse, but the particular realignment of a person who has just identified which side of a line they need to be standing on. She looked at Michael the way you look at someone you are in the process of deciding you do not know. Fitch set the pages down. He straightened them against the table, the same compulsive gesture Michael had been making all morning, and I noticed that and said nothing about it. "Mr. Hayes," Fitch said to me, "I need a moment with my client." "Of course," I said. He turned to Michael. He spoke quietly enough that the specific words didn't carry, but the tone did, the flat, controlled tone of a lawyer who is explaining to a client that the ground has changed and the strategy they came in with no longer applies. Michael's head was down. He nodded once, then again. Then Fitch closed his folder. He stood up, and when he stood, he picked up the folder and held it under his arm, not the posture of a man taking a break. The posture of a man who is leaving. "Mr. Hayes," he said, and this time he was speaking to me, "I'm not able to continue representing Michael in this matter. What's been described here goes beyond the scope of what I was retained to do, and, frankly, beyond what I'm willing to put my name on." He looked at James briefly. "Your client will be receiving a withdrawal of representation by end of business today." He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame and looked back at Michael. He said, "I'd get your own counsel, independent counsel, someone who knows the full picture." Then he left. The door did not slam. It closed with a soft mechanical click that was somehow louder than a slam would have been. Michael sat in the silence that followed for a long moment. The document was still on the table in front of him. His own words, his own signature, his own margin notes in his own handwriting. "Dad," his voice had changed completely. The confidence was gone, not gradually, the way it had been draining for the past 10 minutes, but all at once, the way a structure fails when the last load-bearing point gives. "Dad, I'm sorry. I want you to know that I'm sorry." He looked up. His eyes were red at the edges. It was Victoria's idea. The whole thing, the 48 hours, the filing deadline, Coming here like this. That was her. Victoria had been gathering her bag from the chair beside her. She stopped. "Excuse me," she said. "You pushed this," Michael said. "You've been pushing this for 2 years. The properties, the deed, the power of attorney. Every time I said slow down, you said we were running out of time." "I suggested we talk to an attorney," Victoria said, and her voice had gone very precise, the way voices go when someone is building a record. "I did not tell you to go behind my back to Dennis Carr. I did not tell you to draft a lawsuit without telling me. I did not know about any of that." James had a legal pad in front of him. He was writing, not looking up. "You knew," Michael said. "You knew everything." "I knew what you told me," she said, which was not everything, apparently. She looked at me once, one brief, direct look, the kind that does not ask for anything, and then she picked up her bag, stood, and walked to the door. She did not look at Michael again. The door closed behind her with the same quiet click. Michael was alone on his side of the table. The document was in front of him. The folder Fitch had brought, the one with the 48-hour ultimatum, the filing threat, the careful legal language that had been designed to make me feel the walls closing in, was still sitting there, unopened now, its purpose dissolved. I stood up. James stood with me. I looked at Michael across the table. He was looking at the surface in front of him, not at the document, not at me, just at the table itself, the way people look at things that are not there when the things that are there are too much to look at directly. "Son," I said. He looked up. "You made a choice," I said. "You made it 11 weeks ago when you walked into Dennis Carr's office. You made it 8 months ago when you let Victoria tell you that 40% of what I built was something you were owed. You made it the morning you called me and said I wasn't welcome in my own family anymore." I paused. "I made choices too. I want you to know that. Everything that happened in this room today, I chose it. Every document, every witness, every word James has written down in the last 40 minutes, that was my choice." Michael said, "Dad." "I'm not angry," I said, and I meant it. Anger would have been easier. What I felt was something quieter and harder, the particular grief of a man who spent 38 years building something and watched it come apart, not in a storm, but in a series of small, deliberate decisions made by someone he had raised. "But I'm done." I picked up my briefcase. James gathered his folder, the thick one, the tabbed one, the one that had been 3 months in preparation, and tucked it under his arm. "The judge is waiting," James said quietly. I nodded. We walked to the door. I opened it. The hallway outside was bright with the particular flat light of office buildings in the middle of the afternoon, and there were 2 people waiting in chairs along the wall. Patricia Chen, the notary, who had driven from her office on Burnside with the amended documents, and a clerk from Judge Winters's office who had been there since 9 that morning. I did not look back into the conference room. I had said what needed to be said. The rest was paperwork, and James had been managing paperwork for 19 years. The door swung shut behind me, and somewhere on the other side of it, Michael was still sitting at the table with his own words laid out in front of him, and the room was very quiet, and there was nothing left in it that belonged to me. James called me that evening from his car. He was still in the parking garage downtown, and I could hear the echo of concrete and the distant sound of another engine starting somewhere below him. He said the countersuit would be filed by end of week. He said Michael's attorney, the one who had spent 40 minutes presenting documents that didn't hold, had already sent a withdrawal notice by the time James reached his own car. He said this without emphasis. "The way you report weather you had predicted 3 days ago." "What does that mean for Michael?" I asked. "It means he pays both sides," James said. "His attorney's hours, my hours, court costs, and whatever the judge determines in sanctions for filing a fraudulent claim against a documented estate." He paused. "Harold Winters doesn't enjoy having his courtroom used as a negotiating tool. He made that clear before he adjourned." I thanked James and set the phone on the kitchen counter. The kitchen was the same kitchen it had been that morning, the same window above the sink, The same faint smell of the cedar cabinet my wife and I had installed in 2003. Nothing had changed in the room. Everything had changed in the room. I made coffee and stood at the counter and drank it while it was still hot. The countersuit moved faster than I expected. James had prepared it in parallel with the defense, which was the kind of preparation that takes months and says nothing until it says everything. By the third week, Michael's legal costs had reached a number his salary could not absorb. His employer, a commercial real estate development firm in the Pearl District, learned of the suit through a business contact who had been in the courthouse hallway that afternoon. The firm's general counsel called Michael into a meeting the following Monday. James heard about it from a colleague who handles employment matters on the same floor. Michael was placed on administrative leave that afternoon and terminated by Friday. The firm issued a standard statement about professional conduct and left it at that. I did not call Michael when I heard. I did not call to say I was sorry, and I did not call to say I was not sorry. There was nothing to say that the silence didn't already contain. Victoria filed for divorce 12 days after the hearing. I learned this from Emma, who had heard from a mutual acquaintance. The filing cited irreconcilable differences, which is the legal phrase people use when the actual reason is too specific to be useful in a document. She retained her own attorney and moved quickly to separate herself from any assets that had passed through Michael's accounts during the period covered by the countersuit, which meant that most of what she had acquired in the previous 18 months was now subject to review. She returned the items. James confirmed this in a brief email with no commentary attached. I read the email once, closed it, and went back to the blueprint I had been reviewing for a drainage project in Gresham that a former colleague had asked me to consult on. It was straightforward work. I was glad for it. The calls from Michael's friends and colleagues, the ones who had heard his version of events over the previous year, stopped. Emma told me later that several of them had reached out to her after the hearing, wanting to understand what had actually happened. She told them the truth in the plainest terms she could manage. A few of them called Michael afterward. Emma didn't know what was said in those conversations, and I didn't ask. Emma called me on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the hearing. She was driving home from work and pulled over before she called, which was something she did when she needed to say something she had been rehearsing. I had known that about her since she was 17. She said she was sorry. She said she had known something was wrong for a long time, and she had told herself it wasn't her place to get involved. And she understood now that this was not a good enough reason. She said it quietly and without excuse, which was the only way I could have heard it. I told her I knew she had been in a difficult position. I told her that Michael was her brother and that she had tried to preserve that relationship as long as she could, and that I understood why. I told her she didn't need to apologize for loving her brother. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I should have called you sooner." I told her she had called now. And that was what mattered. We stayed on the phone for another 20 minutes, talking about other things, her work, a film she had seen, the drainage project in Gresham. When we hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a while in the quiet. The letter from Michael arrived on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after the hearing. It was handwritten, 4 pages on plain white paper, in the same careful print he had used since grade school. He said he was sorry. He said he had convinced himself that what he was doing was reasonable, that I was getting older and the property needed to be managed properly, and that Victoria had helped him see that I was not capable of making the right decisions for the family's future. He said he understood now that this was not true. He said he wanted to start over. He said he hoped I would call him. I read the letter twice, standing at the kitchen counter. Then I folded it along its original creases and placed it in the gray document box on the shelf in the hallway, the one that holds the property records, the amended trust, the correspondence from James, and the copy of the original deed with my wife's signature in the lower left corner. I closed the lid. I did not call Michael that day, or the week after, or the month after that. Emma and I flew to Rome in October. She had never been us, and I had been once, in 1991 for a conference on structural load distribution in historic urban environments, and I had seen almost nothing of the city because the conference had taken every available hour. We stayed for 10 days. We walked a great deal. We ate slowly. Emma took photographs of doorways and staircases, which she said she was collecting for reasons she hadn't fully worked out yet. On the seventh day, we found a small cafe near the Piazza Navona, the kind of place with 4 tables and a counter and a chalkboard menu that doesn't change much from morning to afternoon. We sat outside. The street was narrow enough that you could hear the conversations at the other tables without trying. Emma ordered in Italian, which she had been studying quietly for 2 years without mentioning it to me, and the woman who brought our coffee smiled and said something back to her that made Emma laugh. I drank my coffee. The street was warm, and the light was the particular late morning light that falls flat and even without shadow. A man walked past with a small dog. A scooter went by slowly. Somewhere inside the cafe, someone was washing cups. Emma set her cup down and looked at me. She said, "Have you thought about what you'll do when we get back?" I told her I had the Gresham project through the end of the year. I told her James had mentioned a property review in Lake Oswego that might need a structural assessment in the spring. She nodded. Then she said, "I mean about Michael." I looked at the street for a moment. A woman was closing the shutters on a window across the way, pulling them from the inside, her hands visible for a moment, and then gone. I told Emma what I had told Michael the morning after the hearing, when he had called and I had answered, and he had said, voice unsteady, that he didn't understand how it had come to this. I had said, "You chose. I have chosen." And then I had set the phone down. Emma looked at me. She nodded once, slowly. The way she nods when she has understood something she didn't need explained further. I finished my coffee. It was good coffee, strong, without bitterness. The way coffee should be when it has been made by someone who has been making it for a long time and no longer needs to think about it. I set the cup down on the saucer. The street continued its quiet business around us. I had said nothing, and that was enough. I had nothing left to add. I finished my coffee. The street continued its quiet business. I set the cup down on the saucer and did not look back at it.